go. Let's do part 2 video. And we cannot house a large snake like this in a little bin like this. Only when it's a baby. But anyways, I'm trying to do a video, and one of my retics is crawling around, being cute. But this is indeed a reticulated python, and some people might consider this certainly scary, just because it's a snake. Then we have a big snake and whatnot. But basically what we're going to do, we're talking about Burmese pythons and reticulated pythons. Years ago, I used to breed a lot of Burmese pythons, and over time I switched over to reticulated pythons, and there's multiple different reasons for that. Burmese pythons were more widely bred. I love Burmese pythons, so they were just, they were being bred. Reticulated pythons, less people were breeding them, and there was some really crazy looking retics that I was just cuckoo over. Things, let's say like the leopard burm and the calico. I mean, the calico retic and stuff like that. Those are all things that got me going, but the calico retics were just silly. I just couldn't even comprehend how an animal could be like black and white and orange and yellow. And you know what's really funny? Look, years later, the calico gene is like a random thing at best, and it's not something like, okay, I breed a calico to calico and all resulting babies will be calico. First of all, they're not born calico, they have to grow into it, and it's also very, very random. So you may be lucky to get a handful of those animals that exhibit any kind of effect visually of the calico, even though they are gene carriers in some sense, way, or form. When we started adding other genes, we started with the cow, combinations and stuff like that, and epistatic relationships. We started doing things like that. I'm just following this reticuling up. So it's just funny that we couldn't get the calico to be reliably genetic, but then I ended up producing the cow retics, and that is just crazy looking snake. So back to Burmese pythons, reticulated pythons. Well, I was in my first video talking about historically we weren't getting a lot of captive-born retics. We're getting more captive-born Burmese pythons. And captive-born is really great because health-wise they're great. They haven't gone through a skinning trade. They haven't gone through an exporter or any of that kind of stuff generally. And so all these different things basically gives you control over what that animal basically faced before it ever came to the final keeper, the pet owner or breeder. So that's something. These animals are highly intelligent. They remember things. So if it's a Burmese python and I mistreat it, or it's a reticulated python, I mistreat it, they have the possibility of always resenting people, always being fearful of humans. And when an animal is fearful, this animal, like if I look at this animal is not put off by me just kind of manipulating it, moving around. This snake has absolutely no fear of me whatsoever. It also has no ill will towards me or anything. And it's just a very rewarding social animal that has a lot of thought. She's very determined that she wants to get behind things and do whatever she wants to do. And she doesn't basically complain, or not complain, but doesn't really have any issues with me just managing her and manipulating her. And that's really what we want. When we're keeping these animals, we want to have this interaction with these animals. And one thing about snakes, when they get something in their mind that they want to do, they will just be relentless, kind of like a tortoise, like an African spur thigh. So, reticulated pythons and Burmese pythons. We have the captive bred factor, and captive bred reticulated python and captive bred Burmese python are both great sources of ending up with a larger growing python compared certainly to a ball python. That's going to be the intelligent thing to do. So as time has passed, people have gone into the reticulated pythons, including myself, and we started taking these mutations from the wild that were collected through the skinning stations. We end up with these kind of crazy animals that come in, and I'm very distrustful of people, but we ultimately get to breed them. And then the good thing about that is proving the genetics and then creating captive-born babies, which ultimately go into the pet sector and the hobbyist sector. So a couple of things I'm going to note about retics and burms as babies. I take a baby Burmese python and a baby reticulated python. When they first come out of the egg, nature has intended them to be defensive. They have to be distrustful because literally everything in the world, nearly, can eat them. So nature says, don't trust anything, bite, 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 and try to get away, remain cryptic, hide, because you're gonna be swallowed by anything from a wading bird to a fish. So a little baby Burmese python is an animal, so I'm presenting my hand to it. What do you think? This animal is super hesitant right now, so this really has very little socialization at all. But what I can note, most Burmese pythons that hatch, when they come out of the egg, they kind of are generally bitey and nippy. Just what they should be, I suppose, to be successful and whatever, and ward off anything that wants to eat them. So we got this little animal right here, and if I was going to keep this as a pet, I'd put some work into it because the animal right now is a bit fearful of me. It's very unsure of itself. It's certainly unsure of me. I'm literally a giant monster that just took it out, but I'm getting some pretty good behavior out of this animal. But if I compare a baby Burmese python to a baby reticulated python, sometimes I'm going to note that I can have clutches of Burmese pythons and they come out and they're just biting and they're kind of just really, really nervous. Whereas sometimes I can have nice clutches of retics and you have clutches where they're just very placid. And that's kind of, that doesn't even fit the narrative that, Burmese pythons are sweet and wonderful and retics are crazy. I mean, I can certainly have baby retics come out and you'll get ones that, defensive and biting, and that's just all out of fear. But we really want to call that reactive. Reactive means that their brain is really not fully engaged and the animal is not processing, it's not evaluating the situation, and they just react, and then you get the bites and all that stuff. And these are defensive bites. There's no there's nothing more than the animal just trying to keep you at bay. But they both can start out the same. But I would say largely if I look, hey sweetie, I'm gonna go collect some dust bunnies on your head. If I look at baby Burmese pythons and baby reticulated pythons, I would probably say I'm probably more likely to get bit by a baby Burmese python. But the good news about that is, usually, pretty quickly, I can work with baby Burmese python and teach it trust and get it right over its fear, and then end up having just this wonderful, tractable animal. Well, the same goes for a lot of reticulated pythons. And a lot of them just either can start out great, or you put some effort into it and you get this big, wonderful, tractable animal. And this is what we're aiming to do, is to get this really sweet, gentle, trustworthy animal. And I can get both this from a Burmese python or a reticulated python. But one thing I do want to note, and one of the reasons why I actually keep reticulated pythons for the most part over Burmese pythons is their intelligence. I view reticulated pythons as one of the smartest snake species. And I think, maybe the top of that might be like a king cobra. But reticulated pythons are really on point. And I don't think it would be a far stretch of the imagination to say, well, reticulated pythons are, for the most part, smarter than Burmese pythons. I wholeheartedly believe that and agree with that. And it just makes them a little bit more challenging to keep. Their parameters are very similar, but breeding them, they're a little less forgiving in failures. They take a little longer for gestation. They take longer for egg incubation, and they're maybe not as tolerant in some cases as Burmese pythons have proven to be. But reticulated pythons are smarter. They're just very intuitive. But with that being said, they're also reactive. So if you have one of these snakes and you don't manage it properly, or you didn't raise it right, or somebody else raised it wrong, then that animal may have a behavior which somebody would say, oh, it's mean, or it's this, or it's scary, you can't trust it. Well, that has to do with how the animal's raised, what the animal encountered, and did anybody ever correct it. But if I were to get the just basically starting point of initial Burmese python and initial reticulated python, and they didn't have like the genetics that make them kind of kooky or something like that, but they were just, you know, good, reliable breeds, I would always choose the retic because I think I get more out of it. And I feel that it's something that's a little bit more responsive to me when I'm dealing with it. And you know, I let people handle these all the time. I certainly have my employees, and we do all sorts of educational stuff. And we're using, for all of our big snakes, generally we use reticulated pythons, and they're very trustworthy. You know, I know the animal that's going to be interacting with people, because, you know, that would just be, you know, stupid to put anything that I don't trust into a novice's hands. So we just use very well-known animals that we produce and raise, and they're just, you know, sweet in all different ways. All right, so I'm going to stop this video. So this is number 2 when I'm comparing Burmese pythons to reticulated pythons. All right, say goodbye.